we talked to one of the heads of Dungeons & Dragons about everything from potential crossovers with other IPs to those all-digital rumors.
Video games are the future!
Last week at Gen Con, we spoke with Jess Lanzillo, D&D's VP of Franchise and Product. Lanzillo is a longtime Wizards of the Coast employee who previously was the creative director of Magic the Gathering. Lanzillo has some old-school bona fide surname. She's a longtime gamer and LARPer who's been playing D&D since she was a kid. She also brought an infectious, enthusiastic energy to the room, something that seems to have been passed on to other members of the D&D design team. Now, we had the opportunity to chat with Lanzillo sitting on the steps at the Indiana Roof Ballroom, a fancy venue Wizards had taken over for Gen Con, and we bonded over a shared love of fantasy novels, RPGs, and of course, talking about D&D. Now, we also had the chance to talk to her about some very important D&D topics that often get brought up in Hasbro conference calls, but don't usually get talked about at most D&D press conferences. Like most of the interviews that I do with Wizards of the Coast people, unfortunately I wasn't allowed to use the audio for this video, so what I'm just going to do is summarize the conversation, and you can also find a version of this over on comicbook.com. So we opened our discussion with Lanzillo discussing what comes after the core rulebook release. She mentioned that when she started on the D&D team, she worked with the team to come up with a roadmap of the next 5 years, with an approach of trying to expand the freedom of Dungeons & Dragons rather than give it more constraints. She mentioned that the team potentially wanted to visit existing settings and give them fresh coats of paints, or potentially visit new settings. She also mentioned the idea of creating smaller pieces that could accompany larger releases and push the envelope in terms of creativity without having to meet a certain bar of financial success. She also mentioned her idea of what the Dungeons & Dragons franchise is. Here's a quote. "I think especially when you think not only about the rules, but just Dungeons & Dragons as a quote-unquote franchise, you can look at a franchise as one of two ways. You can go, I want to maniacally over-engineer this thing so that every part is interconnected, and when I sat down and I looked at it, I said, that's not what D&D is about at all. D&D is about individual creators coming in with their own voices and lending that to what we're doing." Now, we quickly moved on to discuss rumors that D&D was switching to an all-digital or digital-focused model. Lanzillo had previously pushed back on this during a Q&A session earlier in the day, mentioning that she had visited a printing press earlier, and she noted that she felt that the dichotomy between digital and physical was actually a false one. "I'm a big fan of being able to provide play experiences to people any way they want to play them," she said. "I actually look at it as a form of gatekeeping to be like, your version of playing is stupid and my version of playing is good. Do I prefer my own version of playing? And do I play in play groups with people who like to play the same way that I do? Yes. And we should all be able to do that, right? But giving players the freedom to create how they want to create, to play how they want to play, is really what it's all about. And I think sitting here and looking at a future where more and more younger players are playing digitally, they're jumping into Fortnite or whatever when they're 5, they want to be able to have a path that they understand. Now, Lanzillo also brought up that in her previous experience working on Magic the Gathering, digital play was actually a gateway to tactile play. Another topic that came up was the potential of more crossovers with other IPs. That's something that Chris Cox had mentioned in a recent Hasbro investor call. Now, unsurprisingly, Lanzillo didn't give any specifics, but she did mention that any crossover would need to make sense. Here's another quote from her. "It's not just slap and dash like, oh, let's just put a fantasy IP on D&D and just sell it. That doesn't really give us anything novel or new. But what are new and novel experiences that we aren't really able to generate on our own? And that could be things that are more globally adjacent, whether that's things that speak to more anime culture or things outside our traditional scope. I think of things like I just did a LARP that was a Downton Abbey style LARP. So it's just, how do we find ways to create new experiences? And maybe that there's a partner out there that can help us do that better than what we can do on our own." Lanzillo also said that she's open to exploring crossovers that don't necessarily fit within the traditional mold of D&D. She said, "If you come to me and say, I want to make, I don't know, Interview with a Vampire, I don't know if that works for us as a business, but let's talk about it. Let's make sure our rules and our framework accommodate that. If that's the experience you want to have, I don't want to take it off the table. It goes back to our digital and analog conversation. We're not Gary Gygax. We don't get to tell you the right way to do it. The fans and the players are going to tell us what they want to do, and we're going to say, that sounds cool. And we're going to have some cool, sick ideas, and we're going to do those too. Lanzillo also brought up the possibility of building out more support for different parts of the game. I specifically asked about role-playing, and since she had brought up romance a little bit earlier on, like the romance genre, I brought up Romantasy as a potential path that D&D could go. And she brought up using the core rules as an adaptive framework that can be built up in different ways. She said, it goes back to your questioning around universes beyond. It's not necessarily specifically about finding a blockbuster IP and doing a thing. It's about what we want to do and what kind of new areas do we want to go to. What kind of mechanical areas do we have unexplored? I'm a big LARPer. I'm a big social role player. It's something that I know the struggles around intimately too. It can be a challenge, and something I really enjoy about D&D is that there are core rules that are more geared towards combat, and they leave a lot of that open. And so, when we look at future-facing products that we want to make, do we want to create products that do fill in some of those gaps, and that do create some of those social roleplay mechanics, and that do have a harder framework to it, but also that make those optional? The possibility of modular optional rule sets also keeps the umbrella of D&D open to more kinds of players. So here's another quote from her. If you're a person that wants to run some OSR style total party kill dungeons and then all of a sudden I'm going to make you read 20 pages about courtship or whatever, maybe you're uncomfortable with that in your game. That isn't a thing that necessarily we want to bake into the actual core of what D&D is. But say we did want to make something that was more romantasy oriented, and we wanted to create that stuff around it. Now, we know that's not going to be 100% of the D&D audience, and that it might be a totally new audience in some ways. So how do we create that bridge back to the core rulebooks, but just note that the combat might be pretty light or something? So we only really had time for one more question, and we decided to go back to the core rulebooks and what she really hoped fans would take away from it. She, did spend years working for Magic the Gathering, and so she brought up a magic terminology. She said, I'll use filthy magic terminology first, but when you have a magic card and it's great and you love it in your deck, and then a new one comes out and it's strictly better, you're going to want to use it. And I think that's what we want to see with the core rulebooks. We want folks to take a look at the Warlock and think it's sick and say, of course we're going to use this Warlock. The Blob of Annihilation has a skull of a god inside of it. That's pretty amazing. She was also excited to see people's reactions about future releases and what they would signal for the future of the game. She said, when we announce whatever all those cool new releases are going to be, I hope everyone loses their mind. And then maybe even in that announcement, we say we're opening up the framework in these deliberate ways with some of these releases, and people can see what that's going to look like. And then they start seeing just how they can not only create adventures and characters within the updated rules, but then also how they can grow their own roleplay experiences and maybe try something new that they haven't tried before. Anyways, that's some quotes from one of the bigwigs of D&D. Let us know what you thought about what she had to say in the comments, and don't forget to hit those like and subscribe buttons.